Cory and I both have classes coming up, and we were asked, hey, to do this webcast. And we were looking at it, we were trying to figure out, as we both are pen testing things quite often, we typically run into Active Directory and containers. Sometimes same test, sometimes different tests. And we were thinking, what's similar between the two, right? You look at them and you think they're kind of different technologies, they're doing different things, but what's the same? What are we looking for? What are we trying to do when we're pen testing these different items? So, kind of going through, if you're not familiar, Active Directory on every Windows network out there, sure, Microsoft's trying to push you to Azure, pushing you very hard. But as we discussed in the pre-show, really, it's probably not going to go away for another 20 years, until you get rid of every single application on-prem and every old file server and everything else that's going on, you're going to have AD sitting around for quite a while, which means opening lots of potential attack vectors for us. Kubernetes, sitting here, Cory?
Yeah, I mean, Kubernetes has not been around for nearly as long as AD, and you're not going to find it on every Windows network, but Kubernetes is kind of becoming, some people compare it to it's the operating system, so to speak, of like infrastructure in the cloud. And so a lot of organizations are continually starting to move to Kubernetes, even if they don't need to. I honestly, I see a lot of companies and they're like, yeah, we're moving our like monolithic web app to Kubernetes from like EC2 or something. And I'm like, why? Yeah. One, it's going to cost more. And now you need to like hire people who know Kubernetes, which is going to cost more. It's a reality we're all going to have to continue to deal with, though, sort of like AD, just as more companies start to adopt it. Yeah, orchestrating and secure containers. Yep. Yeah, it's a whole nother layer on top of everything, right? Now you have your operating systems that you need to patch and secure for the nodes, and then you've got to also do your container workloads securely, and then Kubernetes itself needs to be secured too. It never ends.
Active Directory by itself is very secure. Admitted, it gets insecure really fast as people start building onto it, and has some general issues itself. But you were saying that Kubernetes doesn't exactly start that way, right?
Yeah, it sort of was born out of Google had an internal project called Borg that ended up getting open source, and that's what became Kubernetes. And it's another classic example of insecure by default. It's pretty open and unrestricted. So everything you do with Kubernetes and your workloads in it is tightening things down, which is not the best way to do it, right? It's more convenient, sure, in some ways, but so you run into a lot of problems, or I run into a lot of problems when I end up pen testing a Kubernetes cluster or something of that nature, where really what I'm able to do is kind of because the cluster and the workload is, that's deployed to it is sort of in a default state, so to speak. So it, I would say that it's insecure, and then it tends to stay insecure.
Stay insecure?
Yeah, it's getting a little better. I'm starting to see I'm starting to see less of the things I saw kind of earlier on when we started first getting Kubernetes work at Secure Ideas, right? Mm-hmm. It's becoming a little more difficult, but still, usually if you give me a cluster, I'm probably going to break out of the containers and compromise one of the nodes at least.
Yeah, and unfortunately for the AD side, even though it starts secure, I see things get insecure. We see the same problems over and over and over and over again, which is the same for Kubernetes, right? We historically, since AD has been around forever, people still tend to think of it like a system from 20 years ago when it was released. And the problems that we always see, right, kind of revolve around people making bad decisions when they are building out the environment and giving permissions and things. So there you go.
There's a good question in there. Yeah.
Go for it. Answer it.
Yeah. So in my experience, it's more for like an on-prem installation generally. Like Kubernetes is all sorts of overly complicated in my opinion. And so especially if you're administrating a cluster and deploying it on your own, you're going to see a lot more of those insecure defaults. That's still prevalent in managed Kubernetes clusters. Kubernetes cluster sounds like flavored popcorn or cereal. I would eat that. I would eat that cereal. The Kubernetes cluster, yeah, popcorn machine. So there's a lot of the same issues you would see with on-prem Kubernetes, so to speak, or not necessarily on-prem, but if you were to not go with a managed version of it, right? You'll tend to still run into those same issues with, say, like EKS for AWS is like Elastic, Kubernetes service, or kind of tying into the Azure, right? And AD, you have AKS, the Azure Kubernetes service. Those do provide you a lot of benefit in like managing the Kubernetes node operating systems and kind of keeping those patched. A lot of those services also have their own versions of the node they have like their own container host OS that is hardened against some of the issues you might see in a kind of self-deployed cluster. But as far as Kubernetes itself and with its policies and kind of working within it, the same issues sort of still apply, where I find problems with like role-based access control, overly permissive containers, the ability to do host bidirectional bind mounts to then read and modify files on the host system. Kind of a story time. So I was on a pen test, and I was pen testing a Kubernetes cluster that was using GKE, which is Google Kubernetes engine, I think, in Google's compute platform. And so they have their own for their managed Kubernetes service. They have their own container runtime like OS, and that's what the Kubernetes nodes are deployed to. And so that's like the host operating system, and it's hardened in a lot of ways to protect the Kubernetes secrets and things like that. And it has a stateless file system that's mounted only at runtime to the node and whatnot. But we still were able to, me and one of my coworkers, Alex, I'll name him because he's very smart. We were able to weasel our way down through and still deploy a container to this cluster that mounted the host node's file system into the container as read and write bidirectional bind mount, which if you take my course, you'll see that that's one of the little secret sauces is the bidirectional host, path mount is a big dangerous no to allow. But we were able to do that, get this file system in there. And even though I had all these protections kind of in place, we were kind of like baffled by the fact that we were still able to just move around that operating system and read secrets and basically compromise the cluster because of that, despite the baseline OS supposedly being hardened. I see a lot of the same problems across both. I would say if you're going to choose Kubernetes, though, go with a managed one, because managing it yourself is a lot.
It's a lot. Yeah. Someone said that, they set up a bare metal instance and it took a considerable amount. It was a Veritas there. So
yeah,
I've never set up a Kubernetes cluster myself, but having heard you talk about it, I know it's something I don't want to do. So
yeah, no, I've done it just so I could learn, and then I will never do it again. Unless somebody's going to pay me like a gratuitous amount of money to do just that.
Fair enough. Better for us to continue to see. Yeah, let's help others find better ways to secure theirs, right? So very good. So I guess you mentioned a whole bunch of different things that are
Yeah.
kind of all there, right? Some of the common problems. When I look at AD, I always link the things down to really two major issues, now three. First, bad passwords, which maybe we see similar in Kubernetes, but people love using those 8-character passwords, maybe 10, but still really bad passwords. Or let's see, people having way too many permissions, because when you're in an organization, all you do is ever get more and more and more. And for some reason, we as administrators and folks can't understand that you need to have more than 2 IDs at this point, which is the third one, the whole idea of account tiering, or as I like to call it, credential compartmentalization. So, I mean, if you had to sum up like the top 3 things for Kubernetes, what would you do? Season 2020, absolutely Veritas. If I'm going to go in, I'm going to do some password spraying, I start with, season and year, because, the story is, well, all right, our story is we actually did that on one client a few years ago. We've got over 50% of the population once. I think we actually hit 66% was the number. And that's because the help desk failed in 2 different ways. The first is when someone forgot the password, because you always change your password right before you go on vacation, but you change your password, you come in, they can't remember. So the help desk would reset it. They would reset it to that scheme. And then everybody at the company realized that's the best way, because if your password policy is 8 characters, you're never going to fail, even if it's fall 2023 this year. So perfect. Yes. And Veritas, that's right. Company name 123 is another one, or company name 1. Or even if you're not following those patterns, 9 times out of 10, everybody is going to follow the pattern of a capital letter, then like 6 or 7 random characters, and then a number at the end. Probably 1 through 0, and then we're going to start back over again. So that's probably what everybody's password is. So yeah, like Cory said there, Hunter 2 going to be the password that I will try, or 3, 4, 5, etc. But all right, so what are your top 3?
Oh, well, it's definitely not password related stuff.
Oh, darn. Okay, so we move past that.
Kind of start with the topic of access control, like IAM. So like Kubernetes has the concept of service accounts, and those are tied to roles, and those roles have rules in them for what that service account is allowed to do, right? Makes sense. And that's specified through through an additive policy. So if there's no deny rules, it's only, everything's implicitly, this is kind of a nice thing with RBAC. If you enable it in Kubernetes, a role does deny things if it's not listed in the policy. So you only are allowing what you need, but I come up against the classic issue with things that have very granular permissions, like most RBAC systems, which is, it's kind of hard to figure out exactly what your workload or your container or whatever needs permissions to do, right? And so I often see people just slapping star in there, right? Like the wild card for things.
Yep.
And so one of the first things I do is, if I've either gotten access through some other way, or oftentimes when I do a Kubernetes related pen test, most of the time I like to do these sort of white box in a way, where it's like, I'll hit the services you're running and see if I can break into the cluster, but also give me access to the cluster too, right? So I can look at the inside at the same time. And so a big one, this actually is back to the same story I had earlier. The way we kind of got around and started being able to deploy things in that cluster is the administrators of this cluster had assigned essentially a wildcard rule to deploy pods, or to manage pods in the cluster. They just gave a wildcard to the default service account, or to the default role, which is really bad. And so oftentimes what I see a lot is, Kubernetes has this default role that every service account in the cluster gets when it's deployed. And you pretty much just shouldn't do anything to that, right? You should create a specific policy and role for what you need to do. But I often see people adding new permissions to that default service account. And so that's usually kind of like the top way that I start to be able to wiggle around within a cluster, right? Is everything has that role. So everything has a token for that. So if I can compromise that, now I can start figuring out what that default account can do. The second one would probably be
Well, so I'll look back while you think on that one. So, I mean, if you don't mind.
Yeah,
So,
no, go take it away.
It was mentioned. So Leon mentioned service account equals domain admin a lot of times. Yeah, unfortunately, it's very true. It kind of goes back to what Cory was saying with Kubernetes. The thing that we see similar is, hey, their recommendations, Microsoft forever. I mean, geez, it has to be, I'm going to say at least since 2003, 2004. So we're looking at 19, 20 years, right? Services are supposed to have very specific permissions on a Windows server. And honestly, it's like run as a service, maybe a couple other things. But what we see is these accounts, they have full admin access on the server, right? Compare that, and then you do this wonderful thing where if you need to actually allow it to be a service account, you need to give it some permissions in Active Directory, perhaps. Now, suddenly, you have an account that is running on a system that has domain admin or very high privileges. We easily get the password because it's configured to be a service. And it's a very easy, quick win to gain access into everything, right? So you haven't been locked down in any way, shape, or form, whether it's on the server or an AD, because people just add more to it instead of trying to build it secure from the beginning. So let's see, what was this? The best way to manage your security logging forward is Kubernetes. Oh, so question from, oh my goodness, Circadian there? What? Circadian. We'll go with that. That sounds even better. Circadian. What are the best ways to manage security logging forward and logging forwarding Kubernetes? Store the logs, or is it possible for you to forward them on an enterprise scale? So that's actually one of the things we wanted to talk about, which is a big problem for both Kubernetes and AD, which is by default, they don't log much of anything.
Yeah. I guess I can talk about logging a little bit.
Go for it.
Yeah. So logging with Kubernetes, that's an interesting question. Like that's kind of like the best way to store them and manage them. I don't know if that's tenable at enterprise scale, but yeah. So Kubernetes kind of by default doesn't really do anything with its logs or audit information, right? It generates a lot of that information, and it's possible to enable that. I don't know if I see that. That's something that's kind of hard to test for when you are doing a pen test. Is, are you logging and monitoring correctly? Unless it's a really collaborative kind of event, right? Which does happen sometimes, but generally the logging architecture I kind of think of is forwarding it, right? Forwarding it to a centralized, instance of, I don't know, Splunk or Elasticsearch or something of that nature. And the architecture I always see for that is using like a logging sidecar, right? That pulls the standard error or pulls files from your containers that are running your workloads and then does whatever processing it needs to do and forwards that on. I mean, that being tenable at an enterprise scale, I think in terms of the cluster, that is fine because like Kubernetes is meant to run, right, highly distributed workloads. The bottleneck is going to be in, whatever you're forwarding it to, like, I don't know, Elasticsearch or something. Comparing again, like if you have your own cluster that you're administrating versus using a managed system in like some cloud provider, those often do have somewhat decent logging kind of already enabled. And it's funneling some of that to like AWS has, what is it? It's like CloudTrail, I think.
Yep.
And then GCP has their own thing that I can't remember the name of, but it's basically like the same thing, right? Where you get this audit of what's happening with your cloud resources. Yeah, $75,000 a week for storing those logs forever. I think I would I would recommend forwarding, right, like that. And if you're running in the cloud, looking at the options that are there, because the managed Kubernetes clusters in the cloud provider services tend to have some form of log forwarding anyways. And that's probably a little easier to hook into like your own sort of log management system if you need a different interface for that to be able to search and key alerts and things like that.
So from your perspective, how often do you think you have to go through and admit it? You don't know because
no problem.
Yeah, you have to ask, right?
Yeah.
But are there special things that typically aren't being looked at, right? You said logging is a problem. So when I go back to my end, I quite often see that people aren't logging the right things, auditing the right things. And so behaviors are being missed.
Yeah.
Which kind of goes back to that other question of, is it possible to do? Domain controllers generate an exorbitant amount of information if you want to be able to see everything that's happening.
Yeah.
But on top of that, people do strange things where they're looking for like domain admins as a group, but they don't look for other key groups that exist everywhere. So are there things that you need to set? You tell people you need to be looking at this.
Logging is hard.
Absolutely.
Logging is so hard. I'm glad I don't have to. That's not really a part of my job.
Yeah.
Because it's really hard. If you, depending on your workload, if you have things sort of keyed, set up, well, like application workload shouldn't necessarily be egressing out to like the public internet, right? And you can log that and look for that, right? You can look for when a certain namespace in your cluster is maybe communicating to the kube system namespace, like the Kubernetes API internally. That sort of stuff is weird, somewhat, right? Mm-hmm. I generally recommend looking at like process trees, kind of process monitoring. That usually requires some sort of third-party thing, though, right? And maybe that's my best recommendation, really, for what to log is to grab something like Prisma Cloud or Falco, to get that like that runtime security kind of thing going on. Those have a good baseline. And then it starts to come down to like, well, what are you doing in your case? And then you have to that's when you have to tune the logs and figure out what matters to you. Kubernetes has the concept of like audit policies, and these policies control what logging information is recorded by the control plane of the cluster. So the kubelet API, the Kubernetes API. And so you can define these policies to say like, well, what kind of logging information do I want based on this? In the Kubernetes repository on GitHub, there's a example policy like buried somewhere way in there. They actually link to it in their official documentation. That is a really good starter policy as well. So I point people to that as well. It's like, this is going to get you like a baseline of, seeing what's happening inside the cluster in terms of the control plane.
Thanks for watching. Don't miss part 2 of this series coming up next.